So I'm Tor Lukasik Foss. I'm Krista's younger brother, and I'm also an artist and a musician. I work at the Art Gallery in Hamilton. I have visual art and a performance practice that stretches back 20 years, which is wildly fulfilling and probably wildly unsuccessful. Who knows? And yeah, I'm thrilled to be part of Krista's launch for Half-Life because I adore this book. So Meta is a singer-songwriter. Can I divulge that maybe loosely modeled after Lucinda Williams in a kind of rootsy sort of way? And there's a song that occurs in the novel as Krista has sort of finished and sent the novel out for publication. She sort of reached out to me and said, you know, we have these lyrics and I always imagined it could be a song. And then you quite awesomely sang into your phone what to my mind is almost a perfectly finished version, like a complete conception of what this song is and how it sounds. And then I was able to kind of put chords underneath it, and we got Fane in to sing a song, and then it became this kind of like real thing. I love that you can, in the virtual world of a novel, you can create a kind of room of play and then translate and create sort of real objects out of it. But maybe, Krista, you can tell me sort of, or why was it part of the process to have that song realized?
It's a great question. It's a difficult question because I think there's a danger in it too, right? And you don't want to impose that on the reader because the song is a certain place in Meta's life. It also has a place in Ellen, the main character's idea of herself vis-a-vis Meta. Ellen is a real participant in the creativity of her family, though her expression is through science. There's a really interesting translation between her scientific creativity and the creativity of her siblings and her parents, who are designers. And so putting that song out there really was, I mean, a way to bring, I'll be really frank, it was just a way to bring joy to this promotion stuff, which is so hard. I think it's hard on writers, and we're not all natural at it. And I just thought, I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to do a few things that I just really or jonesing to do. And I'm not particularly a musical person, but that's a really interesting way to have voice in the world. And it's such a cool thing to imagine, you know, writing a song. And so I thought, frick it, I'm going to give it a try. And I'm going to use this song because it felt like the right moment to put lyrics around it and to give it some momentum.
I think the other thing that thrills me about it is, you know, as you know, and you helped me out with this project we did with Tuesday Choir. I've been part of this pub choir for the last 5 or 6 years, and I've been connected to a group of people who would self-identify as being outside music, but deeply passionate about it. I grow more curious about what I would say is everyone's innate ability to be musical in some capacity. And so I think that, you know, you having never sort of self-identified as a musician, but you've always loved music, and then you have this book and it gives you this sort of mechanism then to explore songwriting, even in this frame of the novel. And then I'm like so impressed by what gets produced, right? It's such a lovely little song that got grafted out of all of that. And I don't know, that stuff really thrills me. I think because I'm very connected with how people tell themselves constantly that they can't be creative, right?
Yeah.
And you have characters in your novel who are creative in all these different spheres, right? And then one is an educator, which is another eminently fascinating world where the teachers that I know often frequently sort of disallow themselves from identifying that job as a creative job or like a job of real constant nimble creativity, right? And I kind of like,
I love that you bring that up because I think that's really part of Ellen's world. She really knows and she's invested in the creativity of her parents, these, especially, you know, her father's design, his cult-like design of these chairs, his idolization of Arne Jacobsen. Ellen knows these narratives of their creativity. She knows the narrative of the house that they grow up in, which is sort of this ill-fated project that Frank Lloyd Wright did, trying to create low-cost house. She knows that narrative. She's a student of her mother's style. She's a student of her sister's songwriting. She's invested in her older brother's architectural viewpoint, especially when it comes to the Museum of Art in Milwaukee. She is, you know, she knows all these, and she doesn't recognize that, in fact, she's deeply creative with her teaching of science. She sees it as storytelling. You know, she does. And it's interesting to me that there's all these interesting parallels that she's, you know, she feels this connection to Niels Bohr, who was described by Einstein as being one of the most musical of physicists in terms of his theoretical, the way he theoretically worked. I mean, the irony is that Bohr, you know, couldn't sing a note. and was deeply unmusical as a man, but his way of thinking was musical, and I kind of love that too. I love the way that we are creative and we see creative expression as voice, but there are other versions of it, other hybrids of it in things like science, which has to be creative. Ultimately, it has to be creative to
Yeah.
explore and think about the world. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great universe of these kind of creative spheres. Even the notion of a character who's sort of somewhat hallucinating a conversation with a dead scientist is in itself, that's a creative mechanism, right? It's almost like a coping mechanism, but it's done through this wildly creative feat of imagine. If you're cynical and you don't actually think it's Niels Bohr.
I think we think that science is hard and evidentiary, and then when you drill down, you realize that it is also filled with narratives that frame a kind of way of looking at the world. And she starts to see the porosity of science, and then that becomes her way through to actually, at the end of the book, actually understand herself more fully as a creative person and a storyteller.
I have to ask the question: why chair design? Like why like because I know like biographically, like you and I grew up with a lot of awareness of furniture because we kind of emerged as very young people in living rooms that were filled with like modernist teak objects only to have them swept away and replaced by vintage antiques, only then to kind of reach adulthood and to become sort of aggressive garbage recyclers and thrifters and finders of things, right? And yeah, I think you need to explain some of like what brings you to the fascination for Scandinavian modernist design and how you kind of deal with it in this world, because it's so deeply fetishized, right, as objects
Yeah, yeah.
still, and they have this power, like.
So for sure, that's part of it. And I think also then it worked out really brilliantly with my characters by having Tig be having Tig be a designer. He could also be idolize Arne Jacobsen, who was this big figure in Danish mid-century modern design, and who, of course, is known for his chairs, the ant, the swan, the egg, but of course did a whole bunch of other things. He was an architect, and he, did the SAS Copenhagen Hotel. He did brilliant stuff in Sweden, and his narrative sort of converges slightly with Niels Bohr. In fact, they both had to escape out of Nazi-occupied Denmark at a time and go to Sweden. And so that being able to integrate all those stories of design, of ambition, of this fetishization of mid-century modern kind of really worked. And then the chair just becomes this singular object that really represents all of that. I think that carries through as a motif because it has all these contradictions.
Yeah, and the chair also is electrified with family narrative, right? Which
Narrative.
beyond its design, yeah, and that's because there's a rational part of my head that has these sort of it's impossible for a chair to be loaded up with psychic electricity, and yet that it's the mind that brings the electricity to the chair. It's not the chair itself that has the electrical current in it. And yet the older I get, the more I think like, oh yeah, maybe it's like way more complicated than that. Maybe it is kind of like at a quantum level, these things do get actually charged with the complexity of the human hands that have touched it or shaped it. Or
I also think the chair it looks like it's one story, right, at the beginning, and then pieces of the story start to fall in place. And so it becomes less of what it looks like at the chair. Sort of, you follow the narrative, the chair, more elements are added, and you have to keep shifting your idea of what it is imbued with.
Yeah, and I like too, because you have these kind of creative disciplines. You have like science and architecture and design, and you have like songwriting, and you have these, songwriting is this thing where we almost expect the songwriter to be sort of emotionally present, honest, to be using their biography to inform what they create, but you then don't assume we think of architecture or design as more objective or more pure or whatever. And I like when you kind of challenge that a little bit. That these fields all are, they're kind of like, they're fueled by a person's biography, they're fueled by these irrational urges as much as they're fueled by rational ones.